Okay, go for it.
Good morning, afternoon, wherever the heck in the world you are. It is 10 a.m. on the eastern seaboard of the United States, and it's Monday. And because it's Monday and it's 10 a.m., you know what time it is. It is time for the Sirius Report. It's time that you get serious. Go to thesiriusreport.com. That is SIRIUS report.com. Subscribe to their premium subscriber services and get the inside intel reports, the daily briefings from London Paul himself to keep you up abreast with the latest news and developments. With that being said, Paul, how are you, sir?
Yes, I'm very well, thanks. Yeah, we're kind of sizzling in the summer heat for the first time really this summer, so it's quite nice, and we makes a
It
change.
is. It is, and over there where you live, you have the Ramadan Vanathon is in full open swing season there.
Yeah, it appears it's just a tit for tat. You know, the idea is, well, if you're going to ram into people in, then we're going to do likewise. And apparently,
Not a
some
bad idea.
rammed into people coming out of a mosque. But I mean, this is this tit for tat, and it's just going to escalate worse and worse. And who knows what the ramifications will be? But I mean, I haven't seen an awful lot said about it. So
Yeah.
maybe someone's trying to keep it low key, but I very much doubt the people involved it's going to stay low key. But I guess we'll see what happens. But it's not surprising. These are the classic kind of problems you're going to start experiencing, not just in the UK, but I guess elsewhere in the process.
Absolutely, man. It truly is something to watch as we enter the summer of chaos, as so many people are calling it, Paul.
Yes, well, it certainly is, and I think it's probably worth talking a little bit about the US economy and some stuff that I mean, we've talked a lot in the past about it, but I mean, there's been this big play by Trump about having this huge infrastructure spend to regenerate the US, and apparently there's a report that's come out from the American Society of Civil Engineers, and they've given it a really bad grading system. I mean, we can quickly say I guess they grade them A to, I don't know whether it's E or something, but
Mm-hmm.
they've effectively said from their guesstimates they expect that the US will need to spend $4.5 trillion within the next 7 years on infrastructure, which probably means about 8 or 9, because the spending never constitutes what is actually needed. And it's given them some damning grades. I mean, these grades kind of C's and D's go for aviation and bridges, dams, drinking water, energy, hazardous waste, inland waterways, parks and recreation, ports. The rail services get a slightly better grade at B, but then you've got roads, schools, solid waste, transit, wastewater. So effectively, the US is in this almighty mess, which we know in terms of the infrastructure. So the idea from Trump's perspective that $1 trillion is going to cover it just will not even scratch the surface, which is a huge problem. And of course, if you look in general terms, since 2009 when we had the crash, every cost is skyrocketed. I didn't realize healthcare apparently is up 54%. College fees and tuition all that 20%, rents up 39%, and all the while, household income has only gone up 3% annually. So if you look at the fact, I mean, they say, well, when the US isn't in recession, well, in reality, the US economy is probably 3 or 4% less in terms of GDP because they rig the figures. If they say, oh, there's another recession, we have another financial crash, the Fed are going to have to monetize probably 200 billion a month, 300 billion. It could even end up $1 trillion a month just to stop the insanity collapsing, and that's how bad the US economy is.
Yeah.
And then, of course, there's a great thing with Illinois, and I did a little bit of assessment. I mean, if you look at what's happening I mean, I wasn't obviously aware. It could be the first state, obviously, that could go bankrupt in history, but at the moment, of course, and I wasn't aware of this. I was talking to CJ before we came on air. Apparently, it's impossible for states currently to file for bankruptcy protection. That's only afforded to counties and municipalities like Detroit did. Now, obviously, if you want Chapter 9 bankruptcy protection, then obviously Congress would have to take up the issue, although the reality is we know doing this is going to be far more complex than just the mere option of doing it.
Right.
Now, of course, here's the problem, that Illinois is just a microcosm of the whole problem in the US. I mean, people say to other states aren't in as bad a shape, and okay, that's possibly true, but the problem you've got is that, I mean, for whatever we think about ratings agencies, Moody's downgraded Illinois, obligation to bonds to the lowest investment grading possible, so almost sub-junk level. The state's got this growing list of bills that it hasn't paid, this mounting pension deficit. Pension deficit is what's given, is just comes up everywhere. So, of course, given Illinois got this lowest credit rating of all the states in the US now, perversely, of course, that means higher borrowing costs, which is the last thing they can afford. But by all accounts, it's the only state that's been operating without a balanced and complete budget for almost 2 years.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, that's absolutely farcical. So
Sure.
on the back of that, they've got this enormous backlog of bills approaching, 15 billion, which apparently is about 40% of the state's operating budget. So it's got this massive pension crisis, which has reached, I think there's liabilities of 250 billion in the state. Now, of course, the problem they also did in terms of this was they've got these government pension funds, which are defined as benefit plans where they promise workers will receive a specific pension when they retire, irrespective of the economic outcome. So, of course, they were probably based on completely wholly inaccurate growth projections and market projections, which has crippled investment return. And then, because Illinois isn't able to fully fund pensions, they then obviously spent this tax revenue elsewhere. And as we were saying to CJ, there's all this threat now. They want to raise taxes, but even if they absolutely cripple the state of Illinois with taxes, it's not even going to scratch the surface in terms of reducing this, unfunded liabilities. So, of course, there's also a shrinking tax base, which is becoming commonplace across the US. So for the last 3 years, Illinois has lost residents as more people without jobs. And its population, I didn't realize that it is at its lowest in about 10 years. So you've got this stagnant wage growth as well. So obviously, it's going to put a strain on the state's ability to grow any tax revenue anyway. What are they going to do? Start taxing people on effectively the lowest earnings and cripple them? I mean, it's just not realistic. Now, of course, the problem you've got in this respect is that they're supposed to have these state legislators are supposed to have a session where they're going to resolve this budget deal. But how is it going to be possible? And this is a growing example of a state that's absolutely just finished, effectively. And there's no solution to it. And how many Illinois are there across the US? Countless ones. And all the while, we're seeing all these projections about US unemployment's 4.3% or whatever it is, and there's all this growth, and yet economic reality is killing the US across the board. And I know this might upset people saying it, but it's the absolute reality. And interestingly, what I went to, because there's this whole issue to do with gold-backed currencies, and I went and did some calculations from a US perspective, because a lot of people always go, well, the US, well, apart from the fact it hasn't got any gold, but if we just do some calculations, if you essentially work out the base currency for like China, which has 30 trillion yuan, and then you remove all the financial institutions and the deposits, it leaves the M0, which is the circulation of paper money, which is about 6.4 trillion yuan. So we can calculate the gold reserves they require to back the yuan. Because basically all you do is, what the MO is, you divide it by the price of gold in yuan per ton and then times it by 20%, which gives you this gold, which is like a gold reserve ratio that says, well, you only need 20% basically to have a gold-backed currency. Now, if you do the calculations for China, they need roughly, at the current price, and bear in mind the price fluctuates, about 4,700 tons. Well, we know China's got 30,000 tons, so no problem for China.
Right.
I did the calculations for the UK. It needs about 500 tons of gold, and it currently has 315. So yeah, there's some margin, but it's not insurmountable. Did the calculations for Russia. They only need about 675 tons of gold, and they've got about 30,000. And then you come to the US, which, as we know, has no gold. And on the current calculations, they need about 19,000 tons of gold to back the currency, which absolutely proves it's just not possible. Even if they had the 8,000 tons in Fort Knox, which they don't have. So this creates a huge problem, and precisely why the US is going to have to devalue its currency. I mean, where it gets any gold from is another matter, but if that's where the future's coming, then there's no basis for the US currency to exist as it does now. Even if it takes a treasury note, it's not going to be a one-for-one backing, which people seem to think is going to happen. It will have to be devalued currency. There's no which way how around that problem. So it's another example. And then I looked into GE, General Electric, and big organization. Once again, it's got this enormous pension shortfall. And the irony is, it had the money, but what did it do? It spent 45 billion on share buybacks to boost the share price because it wanted to win over the Wall Street crowd and all these people who said you've got to get the share price up, where it could have cleared this pension deficit. Now, they've got no money to, they say, oh, we're going to make some indents in terms of this pension deficit in 2017, 2018, but 3 billion doesn't even come close. And this primary cover for G covers about 470,000 people. And it's obviously one of the biggest in the US. So this is the idea, well, G is not in trouble, it can meet its obligations. But when you look at its pension obligations, it's 94 billion. It's only got 63 billion in assets, and arguably it does. Is that 63 billion in assets an accurate reflection of what the asset value is? Probably not, but even at that, that's a funding ratio of 67%. It's just an impossibility. They cannot sustain the business. The free cash flow from its industrial businesses is suffering. There's this huge pension black hole, as we said, and its indebtedness. It has debts of about 130 billion. So even if it's able to fund its pension, the deficit, there's no guarantee it's not going to fall behind again, because it needs to earn 7.5% return for its pension assets each year just to pay the debt and maintain it. So it's an impossibility. So here's a huge organization that is struggling massively already. Never mind. And how do you extrapolate that across all the big corporations in the US? It's another example of the huge problems that the US is experiencing. And yet we keep hearing this repeated mantra that everything's fine, there's not a problem. And then what frustrates me probably more than anything is we have people who in the alternative media who, again, are gathering a lot of interest from people, and this is not just in Facebook term, but everywhere else. And all they're doing is selling this mantra of, we're patriots and we care about America. And they're coming out with ridiculous suggestions as to how the economic situation in the US is going to be resolved when it isn't. And it's detracting a lot of the fact of what we're trying to explain, the reality of what's going on. And unfortunately, for every person who follows, Rogue Money or what I do and elsewhere, there's 10 or 15 who believe these people. This is the reality. And it's just nonsense. There's this idea that this magic pot of money is going to save the US. Well, where's it coming from? Does it exist? Well, I've seen no evidence of it. And this is becoming a huge problem, because then I get people saying to me, and I'm sure you've had people who say, well, hang on, this doesn't stack up with what everyone else is saying. But the problem is they're just being deceived. There's no reality to this idea. The US is in a huge mess, and the only way it's going to get out of the mess is by the wrecking ball destroying the cabal. And in the process, it's going to cause huge problems. But you can't rebuild a nation that's that contaminated from top to bottom, where everything financially is just an illusion, a complete lie. It's fraud and everything else. And I'm not just picking on the US, it's the same across Western Europe and beyond. Yes, there are huge problems, but there needs to be a realization of people that there isn't some magic solution to this. And yet I repeatedly get people imagining that it is and coming out with all manner of ideas that somehow there's going to be this magic solution to resolve the problem. It's the cabal. You can't just pacify them and tell them to go away and hope that they'll just pack up, and disappear into the night, because they've got too much invested in this madness. I mean, as much as they're losing, and they have lost effectively, even though there's many battles still to fight, they're not going to just give up, because they've got everything invested in it. And yet somehow people think there's a magic solution, and in just 15 minutes of highlighting a few points, picking on a state, picking on a big organization, and generally problems in the infrastructure. There is no simple solution. It's going to be a very hard few years until we get through the other side. And then, once the US is rid of the cabal and other Western nations, they've got an opportunity then to rebuild a nation on a level playing field. But it's like the idea everyone thinks, well, just cancel all the debt. But there are repercussions for cancelling all the debt. You can't just say, well, let's cancel it, and it doesn't matter, because how do you iron that problem out? And yes, people can say debt's fraudulent, and People take up out loans and the debt's fraudulent. But in the end, it's rather like saying, let's just take a sledgehammer to the oil industry. As I've said before, you can't do it. There are repercussions. You're going to put a lot of people out of jobs. You're going to bankrupt people. And in the process, you're going to hurt the little guy way more by just taking this wrecking ball to the whole process. But unfortunately, ultimately, to a large extent, the wrecking ball is going to affect people because it's the only way to rid the insanity. And as much as Trump is trying to take the wrecking ball, you can see, and I think there's a point we'll talk about the sanctions in a minute that have been applied to Russia, and I'll go into some detail because there's a lot of interesting points with respect to that. But there is a lot of effort being trying to made. But when you've got the Senate and the Congress basically still largely in the back pocket of the cabal, they're going to thwart every decision they possibly can because it's in their interest to keep the insane gravy train going as well.
Absolutely. You're right about that, Paul. It is about keeping the gravy train rolling. Everything about it is about keeping the gravy train rolling, from our markets to the current system. It's almost as right now it's a run to failure. Just run the damn thing until the wheels falls off of it.
Well, yeah, and in the process, the illusion is you can pump stock markets. You've made the point before, the Dow could go to 100,000. It can go to 1 million. Who cares? Yeah. It's an irrelevant. The S&P is the same thing. You just marry all the stats up with economic reality to the S&P 500 companies and the wheels just fall off. But it doesn't matter anymore. It's like they'll manipulate anything that's paper. They can manipulate currency. They can manipulate, and they do manipulate gold and silver prices, etc. But it's an irrelevance. It's an illusion. And it doesn't matter because in the end, what's going to kill them is economic reality, and it is beginning to kill them. I mean, what are they going to do in Illinois? What are they going to do in General Electric? What are these companies going to do to survive? The economic reality in the end is going to kill them. And the whole basis and the problem is that zero interest rate policy and QE destroys economies. You can do it for short term, maybe a few months. You try to do it for years on end, as they have done. And ultimately, it just kills everything. But they have no other way. What do they do now? I mean, yes, they raised interest rates, but the reality is there'll be some backdoor fudge to get around that problem. But the whole basis of any economic growth, now you look at all these predictions, is coming out saying, well, we now need to see interest rates rise. I mean, that's the whole basis for Obama's, plans for economic growth and stimulating the US economy. Well, if you raise interest rates, you're just going to destroy the US economy. Well, what's left of it in the process? And of course, the new sanctions against the US applied against the Russians has raised some, from my perspective, very, very pertinent points. I mean, obviously, the outline was an amendment to a bill imposing sanctions against Iran. And what they've essentially said is, look, we're going to impose these huge penalties on any enterprises that cooperate with Russian oil and gas companies. Well, one of the main targets for that's going to be the Nord Stream 2, which is the pipeline that will allow Russia to supply gas to Europe under the Baltic Sea. Now, of course, the Senate approves this 98-2. Well, congratulations to the two people who defied them, who are actually thinking about what's going on. But obviously, it needs to pass the House of Representatives and be signed by Trump into law. Well, we'll see what happens in that regard. But basically, what's interesting, and we've spoken about Germany and Austria being part of a new plan for a new Europe, and there's a lot of work and discussions going on, and their foreign ministers and of Germany and the Austrian Chancellor came out and said, look, this is utterly ridiculous. You're saying you're slapping these sanctions on the US. Now, apparently, it isn't just the Ukraine conflict. It's now, we can slap sanctions on Moscow because of their alleged meddling in the US presidential election, which there's no basis for, as we know. But in the process, these sanctions are going to cripple European energy industry. It's not actually going to affect the Russians, but in the process, it's going to cripple Europe with a loss of thousands of jobs. Yeah. So effectively threatening German and Austrian and other European enterprises with the penalties it's just going to cripple them. And all it's doing in the process is driving another nail in the coffin lid of US-European relations. Now, it's interesting that what the Germans and Austrians pointed out is to US senators, look, you should be listening to Tillerson, because he's put doubts saying that these additional sanctions are going to have no effect on Russia. And he's saying, look, we need to have this more flexible idea of how we deal with this problem. And he doesn't want to see Washington, what he termed handcuffed to this process in the implementation of the Minsk agreements, which we know is a farce because it's Kiev who won't implement them. And Russia's got nothing to do with them anyway, in reality. They're just a facilitator to try mediate between Donbass and Kiev, which Donbass obviously is in East Ukraine, which is where the civil war is. Now, Tillerson's saying, look, I'm getting it in the neck morning, noon, and night from US allies and partners in Europe and the Middle East and Southeast Asia that this insanity and this impasse between Washington and Moscow's got to end. Washington, you're going to have to improve relations because the current status quo is where all our economies are getting massively impacted by your actions. Now, for anyone who's not aware, the Nord Stream 2 gas project involves a lot of companies in the West. So you've got OMV, which is in Austria, Royal Dutch Shell, Wintershall, which is in Germany, and they've put a huge amount of financial muscle into it. So all the funding required for 2017 developments in place, and it's largely come from these Western organizations. Now, the interesting thing is that Wintershall has said, that Ukraine's are obviously kicking off about the fact that if they implement this Nord Stream 2 pipeline, it's going to cripple the Ukrainian economy. Well, Wintershall said, we're not interested. We don't give a damn what the Ukrainians say because, do you know what? You've had all these subsidies for decades because the gas has gone across your, pipelines across your land, and you've not put a single, literally, dollar into the maintenance of these pipelines. So who cares anymore? Russia's our supplier. They're the ones that are going to get, meet the demand for natural gas in Europe. So we don't really care about you anymore. And this is where you're now starting to publicly see the German-Russian part of the whole, what I call the Berlin, Moscow, and it's now Tehran and Beijing axis. And you've seen for a long time the kind of Moscow, Beijing aspect. Then you start to now see Tehran fitting into that very publicly. And now with this Nord Stream 2 pipeline, you're starting to see the Germans vocally saying, enough's enough, we're sick of this. These sanctions are going to cripple our economies in the process of you trying to prevent the implementation of this, because that's effectively what they do. Well, we know why, because the US wants to export all its LNG to Europe, even though it would cost Europe considerably more and wouldn't meet the requirements for because the capacity through the Nord Stream 2 is about 55 billion cubic meters of gas a year. Well, the LNG is never going to provide it. It's going to be more expensive. And Germany and Austria know full well this is just a Washington gambit to not only scuttle the Russians because they want to dominate the market, but also Germany and Austria will lose a lot of work. The gas and oil companies in the process through all these projects are going to lose out, and they're not going to take it anymore. They're sick to death of it. I mean, the Nord Stream 2 has been approved by practically every nation now in terms of the construction. And the European Union itself wants this to go ahead because it realizes, despite all the rhetoric, that it has to work with Russia. It can't work against it. And this is why, in essence, if you look at Germany as a nation, you've almost got Germany in the new paradigm that knows precisely what it needs to do, where it needs to go. You've got, in the other process, you have the kind of old style Germany, which is very cabal orientated, which is the Merkel camp. And then you've got the people in the middle who are kind of flitting between the two and don't really kind of know which camp they belong in. And this is why you get these very strange kind of decisions made where, on the one hand, you've got this German foreign minister saying enough's enough, and then someone else in the German or in Berlin, the government saying something very different, maybe with respect to Ukraine. But this is a clear indication that they've had enough, and Germany and Austria are not going to tolerate this kind of interference. And the problem is, what's going to happen is if the US, House of Representatives and pass the law and Trump passes it in the process and signs it off, what's the first thing going to happen? Sorry, we're going to sanction all these leading gas companies and all the investment they've made. It's not going to wash. They're just simply not going to tolerate it. But in the process, it's deeply damaging to relations between the US and Europe, and it's just driving Europe more and more into the arms of of Russia in the process. And we're going to see more and more examples of this German-Russian alliance publicly coming to the fore. And I've spoken about it for quite a few years that it was happening privately. Now we're starting to see it happen publicly. And it was the same when Tehran came in from out the cold. It was all very private. Then it became public. And we're starting to see an extension of that to include Germany. And when German economy starts to really suffer, which it has through sanctions, but then this, they just won't tolerate it.
Exactly right, Paul. And I'm not sure why that the American influence does not understand that these sanctions have not worked at all to hinder or anything that Russia has been achieving the last several years.
No, and to put this in context, when you look at the latest figures for the exports from Russia to the European Union, was about 54 billion, which is an increase of 38%. And while imports from the European Union to Russia totaled about $23 billion equivalent, which is an increase of 21%. So the European Union share in Russian total trade volume grew from like 43% even in January, April of 2016 to 45% in the corresponding period in this year. So there's this constant growth we're seeing. I mean, the European Union is Russia's largest trading partner, and Russia is the EU's fourth largest trading partner. And what we're seeing is, I mean, if you look at what actually happened in 2012, to put this in context, Russian EU trade was enormous. And I think it was annually it was 370 odd billion, and it dropped by 2016 to 213 billion because of the sanctions. But now everyone's got wise in Europe and Russia finding ways around these sanctions and saying, well, we continue doing business, and that's why we're now starting to see this huge growth. And it's another example of Europe saying one thing to the Americans, and on the face of it, they're just ignoring them and carry on developing businesses because they know. And we said this before, from Europe's perspective, they have to rotate east. They have to look to Russia and China to the future, because that is the future. That is the multipolar world, and that's where everyone needs to look. But it's very damaging in the process for the US to take this kind of wrecking ball approach to Europe. Now, they'll naturally, people will say, well, this is a Trump initiative too, because you have to take the wrecking ball to the cabal in Europe to destroy it in the process. Yes, that's true, but is he aware of the fact that Europe already has a new model in place that it's now, and we've talked about Germany and Austria as the two nations, you've got Finland and Holland, and they're all working very hard behind the scenes to bring in a new Europe without the Brussels influence. And that's why you talk about a two-speed Europe in between the north and the south, but there's effectively a three-speed, because there's a European model that's being discussed and slowly rolled out in terms of how the new European model will look without the Brussels and cabal influence. Now, I mean, to what extent is the US aware of this? But it's deeply damaging for the US to isolate itself from Europe in that respect. But of course, the problem is that it's not the first time we've seen this kind of isolationist approach that's happened with Mexico and Canada, with the NAFTA agreement, as much as the NAFTA agreement wasn't working for the US, and I completely understand that, but it just doesn't work. And then you've got the latest business with Cuba in terms of that fiasco in the US. And, this idea of, protectionism, as much as at the start it didn't seem like it was a reality, and it's debatable now just to what extent that comes to pass, but the US can ill afford to be antagonizing nations. But then, of course, equally, as much as there's all this public rhetoric, this instance of these sanctions comes out, there's something very clear that comes out of it. The Senate approving this, they're trying to railroad it through, but they've actually put measures in play which blocks Trump's ability to renege on these sanctions and remove them. So clearly you can see that the Senate is not in sync with the president, which we know to be the case. And we're seeing a clear example of this, that as much as the Trump administration itself and the inner circle want to change things, it's very difficult to make those changes happen in a way that you'll see, instant results. It takes a long time. And again, this is why you have to take the wrecking ball to the Beltway and the US political system, because otherwise Trump can come out with as many great ideas about how he wants to reform US foreign policy and US domestic policy. But if the Senate just vote him down every time, what's he going to do? You're not going to achieve any objective. So that needs to be considered. So when people go, oh, but I've seen in, we can talk a bit about the Middle East in a minute. I see the US policy still, they're doing X, Y, and Z. Nothing's changing. Trump's not doing anything. Well, actually, there is, because the US, actually, the military is trying to make major changes in terms of policy in of how they handle things within Syria and Iraq and elsewhere. But it's very difficult to make those changes because, once again, it's a bit like the problems the Trump administration has in dealing with domestic matters. It's not simple. It's not a simple question of I'm the president, I change everything. And this is why I also get frustrated when I see people out in the alternative media who just essentially just say, well, all Trump needs to do is tell the world about all the atrocities that happen in the world. Just tell the Federal Reserve you're shutting them down. Just do this, just do that. You can't do it. You don't have the authority. You might be the president, but you don't have the authority and the mandate to go and do this unless you have the support of the people within Congress and the Senate to make these things happen. Now, in time, that will change. But as we've seen with these sanctions, we know it's utter nonsense that the Russians have not done anything in Ukraine. They certainly haven't tampered in the US election, because after 6 months, they haven't found anything to suggest that's possible. So what are they going to do? Scratch around for another 6 months or 10 years trying to frame the Russians for something they clearly haven't done? So, but it just proves the challenges and why it's very difficult, and ultimately why it's going to require the wrecking ball to take the cabal down and everything that's associated with it. And in the process, that's going to cause major problems to the US. But what's the alternative? This endless war of attrition where they just struggle on and try to influence things. But of course, in the process, the one thing that is going to kill them is economic reality. And as we've highlighted earlier, that's precisely the problems they're experiencing. And it gets very hard to hide the economic reality of a state like Illinois. I mean, you can't kind of then go, well, actually, it's not really a problem and no one needs to worry about it. The demographic's far too big to be able to do this, and that's increasingly going to be the issue. And Illinois is not going to be the first state that has these problems, for sure.
Absolutely, and very well said. And that's exactly why we will never get tax cuts. There will never be legislation passed because the Washington D.C. establishment has made it so toxic for Trump to have any type of relationship with Russia. And then in terms of any potential tax cuts, Paul, we can't afford to do it. We can't do it. There's no possible way.
No, and the U.S. economy is. I mean, we've talked about before and very briefly. There's debt bubbles everywhere. There's the auto loan, the student debt, there's government debt, the unfunded liabilities. Everywhere it's debt. I mean, all the US Treasury bills are coming home because people are dumping them, despite, they can fiddle the tick report and make it look like nations are even buying treasuries, but they're not. The reality is nations are dumping them to buy assets, dumping them to buy gold, dumping them to buy silver. And they have. I mean, they've been fiddling the tick report and, I did an analysis a few years back looking at where all the treasuries were going, and there was strange, Belgium had like hundreds of billions of US treasuries suddenly that appeared. Was pretty obvious that's not reality. They simply didn't buy all these treasuries. And then you see strange quantities in very odd places like the Cayman Islands, etc., etc. So there's clearly, and why wouldn't they? They've fiddled everything else. We've got Forex, we've had gold and silver, we've had the bond markets, everything's an illusion. So why wouldn't the bond markets in terms of the treasuries, why wouldn't they fiddle them as well? I mean, it's a statement to the obvious, but that's why it's frustrating. The US will eventually sort itself out, but there's no easy answer. It's not going to happen overnight. Someone's not going to magically make trillions or quadrillions of dollars of money suddenly appear to bail the United States out. It's not going to happen. And where's it coming from? And if we look at it objectively, if that was the case, we're trying to say that the cabal, throughout its history, has gone around the world raping and pillaging, stealing every asset known to man, but it somehow didn't manage to steal all this money, which can wipe out all the debt and all the problems. So effectively, everything they've ever stolen, there was even more money they didn't find. And magically, this will bail the US out, and it's not. There's no reality. And if it's true, well, when's it going to happen? Because people have been talking about this for years, saying that all these things are going to happen. And do you know what? It just frustrates the problem of dealing with the reality. There's a harsh reality, and the US is one example. The UK has massive problems. So does Western Europe and Eastern Europe, for that matter. There are massive problems that need to be addressed. But the US obviously has the biggest problem simply because it has the reserve currency. And inevitably, if you just use it as a credit card, which they've done, when your creditors come in saying the game's up, you're going to have far more problems than any other nation in the process.
Absolutely. And around the globe, Paul, we're witnessing so much pushback. In South Korea, we're witnessing that they don't want the THAAD missile system. In the Germans, they don't want the new sanctions imposed. And then also, I want to get your insights, Paul, regarding the USS Fitzgerald. Was that potentially another pushback against U.S. intervention?
I think so. Well, let's look at. I mean, obviously, for anyone who's not aware, probably most people are. Obviously, there was an incident between the USS Fitzgerald and this Filipino flagged. It was called ACX Crystal, that happened early hours local time Saturday in Japanese waters. Now, I found some stats that the US Fitzgerald weighs about 9,000 tons. It's got a length of 500 feet or 150 odd meters for people who metric. And then the ACX Crystal obviously is about 30,000 tons and has got a length of 700 odd feet. Now, or 220 odd meters. So, there's this tanker. And then you've got this state-of-the-art US destroyer. The question is, how the hell could it collide with a merchant ship, given modern technology, radar, GPS, on a vessel of this importance, the USS Fitzgerald, and also in waters where you'd expect everyone to remain vigilant, currently. Now, if you look at the ACX Crystal, its travel route, which you could look on marinetraffic.com. Now, here's this merchant ship, a Philippine vessel in Japanese waters. Now, strangely, the marine traffic records suggest that this container ship suddenly literally did a handbrake turn roughly 25 minutes before the crash. So why did it change its course? And then afterwards just did another U-turn and carried on towards its correct destination. Now, apparently there's no records for the USS Fitzgerald publicly available. I'm sure there are somewhere. So, and unfortunately, apparently there's 7 sailors that were found dead in flooded berthing compartments because the collision caused this big gash under the water, the warship's waterline. Apparently they did heroic efforts to stop the whole ship sinking, but obviously the destroyer's flooded, they've contained it, it's unable to operate. Now the question is, how the hell did an unarmed merchant vessel manage to come that close? I mean, it couldn't have been an accident. You'd have to be blind to avoid hitting the USS Fitzgerald. And the question also says is, well, this is supposed to be the state-of-the-art US destroyer with all the modern technology. How did it not say, hang on, there's something on our radar that's 10 miles away. Oh, no, it's 5. It's 1. No, it's heading straight towards us. And you'd then say, well, hang on, what the hell's going on? So it appears that the USS Fitzgerald had no idea that this ship was heading towards them. Now, they may argue and say, well, we didn't expect it to ram into us. I mean, and the argument would be, is it an accident? Well, it's a Philippine vessel. I suspect it isn't an accident because, I mean, yes, if they've been passing each other and hit each other, you might have said, okay, but what vessel does a U-turn in the middle of the Japanese sea and then actually about 25 minutes before it crashes into this USS Fitzgerald? That's not normal, and then proceeds on its stated intended journey further on to Japan. That makes absolutely no sense. So does the merchant ship have some kind of radar jamming device on board? Possibly. Maybe not. Was this job, was this a test of the US, military defense system, and the US systems failed the test? Possibly. And the question is then, obviously, if that much damage can be done to a US warship ramming it, then obviously what would a single missile cause to? Well, it'd sink the ship, undoubtedly. And it suggests that this US warship's now very vulnerable to missile attack. If it can't see a dirty, great big merchant 30,000-ton ship heading towards it, then what hope has it got of seeing a missile potentially? I mean, what would happen if this ship had got within half a mile and then just fired a missile at it. I mean, it's absolutely farcical, but it's in keeping that the US military technology just is found wanting. I mean, what's the latest thing? I think it was the F-35s. Well, they had to ground them because of oxygen deprivation to the pilots.
Right. Numerous
I mean,
instances of that, right? Yeah.
yeah, I mean, everywhere along the US technology is just being found wanting, and I think the fact it was Philippines based seems, you know, I mean, this is a bit conspiratorial, and I haven't got any proof for this, but we know what's going on in the Philippines with ISIS and how the US have started to suddenly meddle in terms of dealing with the problem. Even though it's very funny that Duterte suddenly calls out the US and then ISIS suddenly launches a full-on attack in the Philippines. And
Right.
the US come along to help, probably helping the same way they've been helping in Syria for the last 5 years or 6 years, i.e. not helping. So, you know, maybe there's something, but I think clearly this was deliberately a ram job. And it could well be there was an idea to test the theory of, well, is this state-of-the-art US destroyer up to it? And we've seen what happened with the Donald Cup previously, where all its electronics were jammed, and it has something happened. I mean, they're not going to admit that publicly, because then you're basically saying our naval fleet is just there to be shot at, you know, sank to the bottom of the ocean. And what's interesting is, in that regard, is that in terms of other US naval movements, the Nimitz is supposed to be heading for the Middle East via Hawaii, but the Vinson, which was, you know, the big flagship in terms of the Korean Peninsula, is leaving the Korean Peninsula now. And why is that? Because the US was essentially told, look, if you start meddling in this area, we'll sink all your naval fleet, and you won't even know it's happened, and it'll be at the bottom of the ocean. That was how serious the threat was. That's why the Vinson's clearly backing out of Korea. But currently in the Persian Gulf, it's the US US naval presence is pretty light on the ground, because the USS Bush has recently left also. So the US is kind of moving out and backing away from where there are, you know, hotspots. I mean, the Middle East is a huge hotspot, as we know, with Qatar, and as well as what's going on in Syria and Iraq. And for that matter, the instability in Saudi and elsewhere is a huge potential problem. So the US seems to be backing out in that respect from the Middle East, and also, I think, quite interesting, the Korean Peninsula. Look how quiet it's gone about North Korea. It's like nothing ever happened. It's
Right.
The silence is pretty deafening. So, yeah, I do suspect it was a deliberate act to ram it. The fact it's a Philippine vessel, I mean, they would, you know, clearly this vessel's not suffered any damage, which it won't have done. I mean, it's like a, you know, a huge you know, RV hitting a cyclist. They're just going to wipe them out in the process and not cause any damage themselves. And that's a bit of a crude analogy, but it's that kind of process. So clearly there was a deliberate intent, and the fact it's Philippine, I think that's a broadside gesture to the Americans that enough, you know, we're not tolerating this anymore. We know you're meddling. And I mean, as I say, if it had just been a straight graze and some poor seamanship, I'm no sailor or anything, I don't know how, but there are certain protocols in how vessels pass each other. But the fact, if you look at where it's rammed it head on. It's gone straight into the side of it. It's not like it's hit it up the rear or something like that. So there's been a definite intention. I mean, either that or, you know, I mean, someone might say there's crass incompetence in terms of, but I don't believe it. The U-turn, I think, is pretty damning. And I think it's another example of where the US state-of-the-art technology has been found wanting, seriously wanting. Because I don't believe the personnel on board would be that incapable of identifying this huge, great 700-foot-long merchant ship that's heading towards them some distance off, and saying, "Excuse me, what the hell are you doing? Why you keep on this course heading straight for us?" Because like anything, these ships, they can't turn on a sixpence. It's not like driving a car and doing a 3-point turn in the road and driving off. It's not quite that simple, obviously. So, yeah, there's certainly something very, very strange going on.
Yeah, something definitely strange. And anytime the media starts singing the same song regarding this collision, right, you know that there's something more going on. You know, it was a very interesting weekend in general, Paul. And then we also, you know, witnessed where Iran for the first time engaged with, you know, sending missiles into, you know, eastern Syria. We also had the U.S. coalition forces shooting down one of the Syrian Air Force jets
Yeah.
as well. So, what are your thoughts on
Yeah,
that?
I think that's an yeah, I think the Syrian thing. Let's take both angles of what was said by the US, then how the Russians reacted, and then we'll deal with what seems to be the reality. I mean, what the US is saying is that I think it was about 4:30 Syrian time, which was June the 18th. They said these pro-Syrian forces attacked Syrian Democratic forces, and they wounded a number of these. The Syrian Democrat forces are basically the so-called moderate opposition who want Assad removed, and they obviously work in conjunction with the US coalition. Now, the coalition aircraft obviously said that they conducted this show of force and stopped the initial Assad advance towards this, SDF-controlled town. Now, what they're saying is the coalition said they contacted Russian counterparts by telephone via this established deconfliction line and to de-escalate the situation and stop the firing. And apparently it didn't, because this Syrian regime Su-22 dropped bombs. So they went, right, enough's enough. We're not tolerating this anymore. And they took it out. And then they came out with their saying that, the coalition's missions to defeat ISIS, they don't want to seek a fight with the Syrian regime, the Russians, or pro-regime force, and this is partnered with them. But if they show this act of aggression towards the SDF, then they're going to act accordingly. And this all sounds extremely plausible. But then you hear the Russian reaction, where the Russians said, look, from our perspective, we view this US-led coalition attack on the Syrian government military jet as an act of aggression and assistance for the terrorists that the US is supposed to be fighting against. Well, that's not the first time we've heard that. Now, of course, the question is, well, okay, if it's not an act of aggression, it's an act directly in breach of international law, because the whole point is the US isn't even supposed to be in there. But, argue that point till you're blue in the face. It's not going to make any difference. But effectively, Russia has said that they believe the strike should regard as a continuation of the US agenda, neglecting the norms of international law. And, they're very unhappy about it. This has got to stop. And huge representations made to Washington in that regard. So the Russians have a very different perspective on it. Now, what I think, I looked at the location. I've actually started to, ironically, I know the geography of Syria quite well, because I've spent a lot of time looking at various fronts and understanding. Now, what's interesting is the Syrian armies liberated the important town of Rusafa and the crossroads of the same name, which is in southwest Raqqa countryside. And they've killed what they call the jihadist or the terrorist of the so-called Islamic State from this strategic location. And these, Syrian forces were engaged in these fierce clashes with these ISIS or Daesh militants. Now, interestingly, the US-led coalition shot down this Syrian Air Force jet in precisely that area. So there's the immediate, hang on, the fly in the ointment from the US's argument as to what they were doing, because clearly they're using that excuse, well, they're attacking the Syrian Democratic Forces, we're not having that, so we're going to shoot it out of the sky. No, the perfectly logical argument is that, no, they were shooting down the jet because it was part of the engagement in these clashes with Daesh and Islamic militants. Now, what's also interesting is this whole area that Rusafa has got this enormous oil reserve and oil fields there, and they've, of course, Daesh and ISIS, or whatever you want to refer to them, have been using this to sell oil on and for their own requirements. And the point about this location is this allows the Syrian army to secure the future path to Deir ez-Zor, which is very crucial in the region. And also, by getting this Rusafa under Syrian army control, these US-backed, Syrian Democrat forces are now blocked from advancing south towards the Rusafa oil fields. And of course, that is a big dent. This is the one thing that's very deeply damaging to ISIS and Daesh in terms of their objective. If you restrict their access to oil fields and restrict their access to that kind of infrastructure, it's going to severely cripple their ability to carry out their operations, because they're dependent on, not just in terms of using the oil fields for their own requirements, but also because they've been selling on the black market. and they've cut these supplies hugely in the last few months, probably since the turn of 2017. So that's the reality. And I gave the perspective, okay, this is what Washington's saying, this is why the Russians reacting the way they are. And it's self-evident. It was all about Russia because of the oil fields and why they've now, by the Syrian Arab army taking control, it's negated the ability of the Syrian Democratic Forces to advance there. And in the process, this shows that the US lacks the impartiality in terms of dealing with these problems, and yet for a fact that as much as this is going on, in terms of Washington's perspective on this, and how Washington, in terms of the Trump administration, they don't want to see these things happening, but they just don't have the control still in terms of operational activity, and this is the problem. And I'm not justifying people's actions in any way, but you imagine if you're operationally in the field and somebody says, "Look, this aircraft is threatening to attack the Syrian Democrat forces. We have to deal with it and take action." When in fact it isn't. This could be a combination of deliberately misleading, but also there's people making decisions who might legitimately be given intelligence that makes them believe this is true. In reality, it's exactly the opposite. And it doesn't bear scrutiny when you look at the facts and say, well, because as ever, it's where do these incidents happen? Where are they in location to existing Syrian armed forces operations in the area? And what's the strategic significance of the area? Well, we've highlighted that in this little segment, where that's precisely why this attack was made. But in terms of from Washington's perspective, I think the red line's been drawn. I mean, how much more patience the Russians will tolerate, I don't know, but I think in future they'll be tracking the US very closely. And if the US steps out of line, you might well see in the not too distant future Russians taking out the US forces. And I don't think the US will do anything. I think the US will just not respond because they don't have the ability to respond. As much as all of this bravado and hot air, they know that the Russian military is far stronger and far more capable than the hardware. And we just highlighted earlier precisely the problems they have with warships and the F-35s, just to name but two. So, but I could see the Russians reacting where you've almost in Syria got a hot war between the Russians and the Americans. It won't lead to World War III or anything. I think you'll have one instant, and then the Americans will finally back off and go, we're not dealing with this anymore. It's not going to happen this way. But I think in the fog of war, there's definitely a lot of misinterpretation, and there's actions being taken by US forces where they're being deliberately given duff intelligence. And who are these intelligence agencies that are involved in this process, and who's actually ultimately behind them is the very people probably who we know are responsible for the foundation of all these terrorist organizations in the Middle East to destabilize Syria and allow the pipeline to go from Qatar through to Turkey and beyond, and to bypass obviously the Russians in the process. Ultimately, unfortunately, all of this does come back to the Russians. It always has done. It always will do. It's not trying to destroy their credibility on a world stage. It's economically, politically trying to destroy. I mean, they've been meddling inside Russia repeatedly for years, and there's been a big upsurge in that, and the Russians are responding to that because they know full well that if you look around Eastern Europe, we've had colour revolutions for years. I mean, just go back, put colour revolutions in Google and look at them if you're not aware of them, where you've had them. Obviously, it actually happened in Ukraine in 2004, where they overthrew Yanukovych, and then the Ukrainians got so fed up. Yanukovych got elected in 2010, but the cabal came back and obviously removed him in 2014, whereas they'd done precisely that in 2004. So there's a precedent where this will always happen, and anyone who's perceived to be on the side of the Russians is game for US action. But of course, increasingly now the world's rotating away from that and seeing the strength of economic and military strength of Russia and China, and not acquiescing the way they have done. And despite intense provocation, I mean, some of the smaller nations in Europe, I mean, Macedonia's rolled over with the US because it's too small and weak and feels threatened. But any nation of a reasonable size is now standing up and realizing that a lot of the US policy was just hot air rhetoric, but the mere threat that Washington might do something was enough to make most nations back off.
Right, right. Yeah, and then also I wanted to get your thoughts. We had Trump, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, state that that yes, Qatar, there are a lot of terrorists there, everything that's going on, but yet we turn around and sign a deal to supply them with F-15 jets. Are we arming both sides right now between the Saudis and the Qatar? So, any update
Well,
or thoughts on that, Paul?
well, I mean, it's just the sheer farcical nature. The problem is that, and you can, if you go on YouTube, you can look at. It's worth watching. There's the Putin interviews with Oliver Stone. They're out now in 4 segments. They're about an hour each. It's worth watching that because you get a very interesting perspective where he says, well, the US will say all this thing around election time, or they'll make policies, and then they'll phone us up and go, "Oh, just ignore that. We don't mean it. It's just rhetoric for the media." And this is the reality. They're sounding, sounds all very aggressive and confrontational with Qatar. Well, meanwhile, the US still has its largest military base in Qatar. It's not going to relinquish that. And yes, if farcically it signs this deal to sell, was it F-15s, billions of dollars worth of them to the Qataris, and nobody's going to argue with them. But it is the farcical nature. The reality is that Trump has gone around in terms of foreign policy, and he says it makes all these noises, but then the US does exactly the opposite in terms of the actual policy. And I think this is why, if you look at, without labouring too much about Qatar, but it's worth mentioning that the country's running as usual in spite of all this land, air, and sea embargo. There's Turkish troops arrived for a joint military exercise. Well, the timing of that's, I think, hugely significant. You've got the Emir of Kuwait who's saying, we think we're making some headway in finding a diplomatic dispute. And in the meantime, Qatar's going, we're not going to cut off the gas to the UAE because they're our brothers and we don't want to hurt them, even though there's a force majeure in the contract, which means they could just shut it off and the UAE would be in big trouble. And yet the interesting part is you can see the climb down is because Saudi would have looked at this deal with the Qataris and gone, the US aren't serious. So Qatar's saying, well, okay, we want to hear your demands. And Saudi apparently are going to issue them a series of demands about why this embargo is carrying on. So the Saudis are trying to climb down in the process because they realize they're not going to win. What are they going to do? Go to war with the Qataris, which are going to be backed by the Iranians and the Turks? Well, no, they're not. Turkey's meanwhile also lifting thousands of tons of food, as are the Iranians. And the irony is it's a bit like the Russian sanctions. This land, air and sea blockade that's been imposed on Qatar has not impacted Qatar particularly. But the irony is there's going to be a backlash where the Qataris are going, well, okay, you don't want to deal with this. Well, we're going to sign agreements with shipping companies that will provide direct services instead of having to go through Dubai and elsewhere. So fine, if you don't want to trade with us, we'll just sign other deals and wreck your economies, which is because they've learned that from the Russians. Don't fight sanctions. You don't need to just go and sign deals and de-dollarize in the Russian case. And the Qataris are doing a great job in terms of managing this process. So economically, it's not really impacting them. They're getting the support from Russia, Iran, and Turkey. And this is why I think the final nail in the coffin for the Saudis was this Qatari deal. And the truth is that the US is desperate for business. It's cut its nose off to spite its face with just about every nation. So anyone who'll sign a trade deal is a trade deal that the US needs to make. And sadly, arms is one of its greatest exports. It doesn't export a huge amount else to the world. So they'll do anything, but it proves the point that the US know full well that Qatar are no more guilty of infractions in that respect of to do with terrorist attacks in that region than Saudi or these other nations. I mean, it's kind of reached that point of absurdity, and I wouldn't say we're out the woods yet. I'm slightly concerned that Saudi's now backed into a corner, and of course the big threat for Saudi is it looks extremely weak domestically. That's more of a problem than looking internationally weak in the Middle East, because the other nations don't really want to take part in this process. But domestically, they're weak, and Saudi's teetering on the edge. I mean, the House of Saud could collapse quite easily, and that is a huge problem for the West as well, because if Saudi suddenly collapses, who's going to fill the vacuum? Well, the risk is you're going to see the Islamicist terrorists, for want of a better word, like ISIS, etc., all swarm into Saudi, and they've already threatened the Saudis on several occasions that they're going to launch attacks on them. So I think that's pretty damning indictment of how they see the weakness of Saudi. So again, a stupid decision by Saudi, and how do they get wriggle out of this? There's going to be serious repercussions. But nations in the Middle East are already talking to other nations, and who you would say are on the Qatari side of the fence, although not directly, and because they don't want anything to do with this. And I think really it seems like utter hypocrisy, but the US frankly just don't really care from and probably now realize that backing Saudi against Qatar is a very foolish move, because they have the support of the Russians, they have the support of the Iranians and the Turks, and also increasingly, even though we don't hear very much, China's kind of very quietly moving around in the Middle East in almost under the cover of a kind of cloak of invisibility, but they're making some serious moves in the region. And the overwhelming situation from the Saudis' point of view is they're backed into a corner, and the US aren't going to back the Saudis in a war with the Qataris.
Right? No.
Absolutely no way.
All right, Paul, we have a couple minutes left. If you want to go ahead and share your website and your premium content information, how our listeners can learn more about that, please.
Yeah, well, thanks. I mean, obviously the website's the SiriusReport.com. That's SIRIUS. Report, all one word.com. We have the Facebook page. We're thinking of actually bringing out a Facebook group to supplement that in the future, but at the moment that's just obviously the Sirius Report. We have the Twitter page at the Sirius Report, and yes, we have the premium content page. We'd love people to subscribe. We've had quite a few people in the last week, so thank you very much for that. And yes, essentially we do 5 podcasts a week, 10 to 15 minutes. It's very condensed information. It's not, the words are very sparse. It's to get the message across. So, compared to probably what I do in 10 to 15 minutes, in that is probably what I do in an hour's show today, for example, in terms of the content. When we cover off a lot of information globally on a daily basis, it's geopolitical, it's financial, just to try and give people an understanding of what's really unfolding. And we think it's very good value for money for $4.75 a month. And we have 100, I think we're up to 180-second podcast coming out
Excellent.
today.
Awesome.
So
that's great.
They've got a lot of backstory. I mean, I'm not sure anyone would want to listen necessarily to the first one, but you can if you want, if you've got a lot of time on your hands. But there's a lot of information, and it builds a picture from the period when we started them. And if anyone was to, or people remember, we put things out, and then the picture, the puzzles comes closer and closer together, and you get a greater understanding. And Germany and Austria, as we've spoken to today, is a great example. We've talked about that a lot in the podcast. We've talked about it previously on the shows as to the significance and the importance of how Europe's changing. And these are big hints as to the direction. And you made the point as well, when you see the Iranian involvement in Syria now, these are all very, very important changing points in terms of the geopolitical, the world as we see it. And the Middle East and Europe are big hot potatoes, and have been obviously for decades. And we covered a lot in the US. I mean, there's a lot more we could talk about it, but we need to bear in mind there is no magical solution. And it may frustrate people. There's going to be people out there who disagree with me. Well, that's fine, but what we've talked about, what Rogue Money talks about, and other people, this is all proven. We've explained things, they've come to pass. We have a track record, all of us, of getting things right. Well, we're the ones getting the things right, and these other people are saying a lot of things, and when is anything actually happening? It's not. And it is frustrating, because we want to find like-minded people. It's great for me to team up with Rogue Money, and they reciprocate that, because it reinforces the work we're trying to do and get the word out there as to the reality of what's going on, and rather than some fantastical idea that all these magical solutions are going to come to pass, because there's no evidence to support that. And great if it happens, but after 3, 4, whatever, 2 years of these people saying this, I don't see any evidence of it.
Absolutely. And Paul, we appreciate your partnership, and I want to thank our listeners for listening to today's show. Please make sure to follow us on roguemoney.net, at the Rogue Money on Twitter, and then also check out our Steemit blog. Make sure you're following. We post all of our content from both our YouTube and our roguemoney.net on Steemit. So that's just Rogue Money. So follow us there as well. And this is CJ, and it's been a great show today. So Paul, thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to everyone who listens and supports all of us, because we all really appreciate it.
Very good. And we're over and out.